Good morning all. It is my pleasure, Bill Hassel, to be Chairman for Session 5, Federalism and Western Australia is the heading. I'm looking forward very much to hearing from Senator David Leyonhjelm as to his commitment to Western Australia. Our two speakers are the Honourable Mike Nahan, who is to speak on Western Australia and the GST, followed by Senator David Leyonhjelm on Western Australia and secession. Before actually introducing Mike Nahan, I couldn't resist the temptation to see poor John Stone finally have a heart attack by doing a welcome to country. So overnight, to avoid that risk, I prepared a new welcome to country, and it could be called the John Stone Welcome to Country, but this is how it goes. It's quite short. It says, "As we gather here at this time, we acknowledge our ancestors and forebears, all those men and women who came before we were born. We acknowledge that their values and beliefs, hopes, aspirations, virtues, work, mistakes and failures as people have made Australia as it is today. We recognise that the forebears of some Australians were in Australia long before the forebears of others, and some of recent settlement have no forebears from Australia. We celebrate the coming together of people in Australia who now constitute this nation of people, one people under one law, recognising one sovereignty, and who share common commitments to freedom under law, security for all, opportunity for all to succeed and realise their dreams and aspirations. We recognise that all must give as well as take, and that even in freedom, rights are balanced by responsibilities one to another. We celebrate our nation and its people and the lands we share." Now, I think that's preferable to smoking. Now may I introduce the Honourable Dr. Mike Nahan, who is the leader of the opposition in Western Australia. He has the incredibly unenviable task of trying to pull the Liberal Party in this state out of a very deep hole after a devastating loss of election earlier this year. It's a challenge with which I am sorry to say I am thoroughly familiar. Dr. Mike Nahan was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1950 as one of 13 children, and grew up on a small farm, later graduating with a bachelor's degree in economics from Western Michigan University, before graduating with a master's degree in agricultural economics and a doctorate in economics from the Australian National University. Dr. Nahan worked as a policy director with the IPA, and between 1995 and 2005, he was the executive director of the IPA. Dr. Nahan was elected to the Parliament of Western Australia as the member for Riverton in 2008. In 2013, he was appointed the Minister for Finance and Minister for Energy, Citizenship and Multicultural Interests. And from 2014 to 2017, he was the Treasurer of Western Australia. Since the 2017 election, he has been the Leader of the Opposition. He is uniquely qualified and placed to speak about this very serious problem that we have with the share of GST which comes to Western Australia. Dr. Nahan.
Thanks, Bill. It's a real pleasure, and that statement will be called the Hassel Statement from now on. It's a real pleasure to be here. I have attended many Samuel Griffith societies over the last 25 years. I've read many of your speeches given. This is the first time I've had the honor to speak, and I'd say it was a good time to save up for it, because this is a really important issue. If you follow the politics in Western Australia, the Labor Party's conference, state Labor conference is in town today, and Bill Shorten has had his eureka moment. He's come down from the mountain with his tables of saying, I have solved the GST issues. Actually, what he's done is perpetuated the problem we've had for decades, and that is, because of the problems of our constitutional structures, or rather the interpretations of it, he's gone out and promised either to borrow $1.6 billion, or probably more, tax more, and use those proceeds to so-called paper over an issue in Western Australia. It's an illustration of the problem, not an illustration of a solution. What I propose here today is to discuss with your learned people an issue, a proposal that I want to pursue, because the Samuel Griffith Society is the right group to begin this discussion. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a politician now, an economist before. I've spent a great deal of my life, as you heard from Bill, looking at federal fiscal issues. My first task with the IPA was the state's policy unit, where I went around and commented on federalism and the state budgets for quite a few years with John Stone and Des Moore and other learned people who have been participating in the Samuel Griffith Society for a long time. And one of the issues that you've over and over and over talked about, and what I have and others have, is actually the, if you wish, the misinterpretation of our Constitution. Our Constitution was meant to be a federation of states to a large extent, with enumerated powers between the states and federals, between the states and Canberra. It was based to some extent, an increasing extent, on the Washington experience and the Swiss experience. But actually, over time, it's become, as you know, and I'm not coining a new word, the Washminster, in that it was interpreted largely, increasingly, as from the perspective of Westminster rather than Washington. And so we've had an accretion of power over time. What I plan to do is come up with a proposal that, I guess in some sense, can be figuratively a hand grenade into the fiscal federalism of Australia. But I would call it more positively rebooting the system. And that is, look to a constitutional challenge through the validity of the Grants Commission process. Let me go through that. As you know, you've probably seen quoted many, many times before Alfred Deakin's very famous, okay, thanks. Alfred Deakin's very famous statement that left legally free, that is, the states were left legally free but financially bound by the chariot wheels of the Commonwealth. Their needs will be its, that is, Canberra's opportunity. Less populous states will first feel will first to succumb, storms, cyclones, whatever, joint ventures with the Green Party. And finally, even the greatest and most prosperous states will be brought to heel. Our Constitution may remain unaltered, but vitally changed by the mix between the, particularly starting with the vertical fiscal imbalance. I'm not going to go on these I'm going through these very quickly because you know them all. We have, because of the alignment, whether constitutionally determined or legally determined, a huge imbalance between the revenue raising and expending capacity of the Commonwealth and states. The Commonwealth has accreted to it the lion's share of spending power and left, legally I guess, a great deal with the states. But as any politician knows, politics is all local. I get involved in local government a lot. The Commonwealth gets involved increasingly into state and local government, and they have the capacity to do so very extensively. An imbalance. And that allows the Commonwealth, indeed allows the states to go to the Commonwealth to solve its problems. Joe Bielke-Peterson used to say the best tax is a Commonwealth tax, because they levy the tax, they get the umbrage from that tax, and we get crumbs from it to spend. A problem. So vertical fiscal imbalance. What I want to argue, I'm not going to try to solve that. That's too hard for now. But I'm going to go at it a different way, well, consider doing so, and that is to use the Constitution to bring into question the constitutionality of the Grants Commission process. I know this will probably precipitate a questioning of the whole grant system, not only to states, tied in general, but also to local government. Go through that. That's Wilshire giving a good statement about the problem. Generally, we have evolved the Grants Commission process slowly, steadily since 1930s, and then in the 1950s and 60s, more formulated, basically on a basis of horizontal fiscal equalization. I heard the guest speaker, I think Chris Kinney, made some jokes about it. But it is a very complex system, and it essentially means it's another Washminterian system where it essentially, if you boil it down, is overriding the states to have a unitary type allocation of resources around the state, around the country. And that it allows, it's actually a socialist agenda, it tax according to those who have the ability, pay to those who have the need. And they essentially redistributes all identified revenue to the states across the nation according to the bureaucrats and the Grants Commission perceived need in other states. So every state has the same ability, no matter what they do, to provide the same basket of services as every other state. And that's basket of services has been widened over the period of time. If you have unity amongst the states, it's not a big issue, doesn't lead to too much difference. States don't have a huge difference in taxes. But if you have a shock to the system, that is, one state does something different from the rest, and Western Australia did it, we had a very open, I don't want to use this word too much, but progressive, bipartisan policy for development of our resources sector. Fraser Institute, a very fine think tank in Canada, in Vancouver, does a review of resources policy around the world, and year after year, Western Australia has been either in the top 5, if not most open state to developing resources in the world. And it's paid off. And we invested heavily over a long time of infrastructure. So when the Chinese decided they wanted to build their economy and get iron ore and oil and gas, well, where did they come? They came to us. We've had $600 billion worth of infrastructure invested in Western Australia, iron ore, oil, LNG, and a whole raft of other things over the last 10 years. Massive infrastructure. We now account for 50% of exports, pushing towards 60. When LNG goes out, depends upon the value, it would be larger. So we've done it, and we've had to go out there and provide the infrastructure for it. When this happened, we ran out of people, 500,000 people. The population equivalent of Tassie moved here, not from interstate, because they were paid to stay put in northeastern Tasmania. When our unemployment rate was 2.5% or less, unemployment rate in northwest Tasmania, a beautiful place, hardworking people, was 8. They didn't come over. We brought them from everywhere around the world. We had costs. We ran out of people. We had the equivalent to Dutch disease. We had to pay people excessively, and it paid off. People in New South Wales think that their wealth is driven by building apartments. It's built by the wealth in Western Australia and Queensland. But what has happened? Well, as the GST does this, if a single state gets a great big whop of money in a unique form, iron ore royalties, they redistribute it 90% with a lag of 3 years. So what's happened in 2002, we were getting about 25% of our income from GST, stable, predictable, controlled. Now we get about 4 or 5%, maybe 7%, depends upon the price of iron ore, and we're very highly over 20% of our income in iron ore. The problem with that is a number of things. First, it's taking the proceeds of the investments of the state of Western Australia and redistributed it elsewhere. There's a disincentive there. Second, it's requiring the state of Western Australia to be highly dependent upon some of the most volatile prices in the world. Let's face it, the iron ore market worldwide, and the prices are spot market, not contract like they used to be, is a gambling den. It varies 50% within a year. How the hell are you supposed to provide services for education, health, police on a long-term basis, stable basis, on the basis of a price that varies 50% within a year, year on year? Already this year, it's gone from 94 to 55. It's up to 76 now, unpredictable. Asked the majors what the iron ore price would be, and they said, we gave up trying to predict that a long time ago. We just are focusing on costs. Probably what the state should do, too. And so we have had a very large increase in reliance on iron ore prices. Thanks, Jessica. This is what the share, traditionally, and I'll show you another graph, the share has been pretty stable. The lowest share before us was I think it was 42 to Victoria, what got down to about 71%. We dipped down to 29.9. In fact, and when I first came into government in 2013-14, the prediction we were on the forecast for an iron ore price at that time, we were going to get 0 share of GST back in 4 years' time. Why would we be part of the Federation? What the hell? And we like Tasmania and South Australia, but, you know, why would we do that? But then the iron ore price collapsed. You know, I'm a bit jinxed. When I came in, iron ore price was $118 and went down to 37.7. So, and then when I left, it's back up again. Okay, but this is what's happening. It's simply unfair. It goes to the foundations of the agreement we have about fairness. When I showed this to John Howard, who's one of our most astute politicians, now he's a bit of a federalist too, you know, well, quite a strong one. But he looked at it and said, not fair. Doesn't pass the smell test, not fair. Next one, Jessica. This is basically the redistribution. This is in money. If you put it on population, which I usually do, it goes off the charts so no one can see it. This is a huge redistribution of $4 billion. Put this in the context, this is not the only form of redistribution. We have income tax, company tax, PRT. In 15-16 was the last time we've estimated. The total net distribution from Western Australia to the other states via Canberra was $20 billion, of which only $4 billion was GST. It's like a colony. Like a colony. Now, people in Victoria, they're least, but in Tasmania and South Australia said, yeah, but you don't need the money. We need it more than you. And it's not just about redistribution of money. We, in terms of per capita income, we have quite a bit. But it stops people from moving. And I'll go on to that next. Thanks, Jessica. This is just the trend since 2001. We hear often that, yeah, back in the old day in 70s and 80s, during when the tariff walls were high, Western Australia was a claimant state. True. A couple things. If you take the total receipts and put it into 2013 dollars and find out what the net present value is, you know what? It's negative, because the drop in recent years has been so profound that it, in fact, it wipes out decades of being a claimant state. And also, back then, back in the day, 70s and 80s, it was largely, the debates were about counteracting the tariff walls, which we had no protected industries, and also stopping movement. There was a big issue. Most of the head office of mining firms used to be in Melbourne, but also in Sydney. You can remember back in the 80s, one Alan Bond in Holmes Court tried to get the BHP to move to Perth. That was all about capturing. And the Premier at the time, a very honourable man called Brian Burke, he supported that, and that was all about getting the payroll tax. So there was reason for that. Those reasons now are gone. This is simply politically, economically unsustainable. Thanks, Jessica. Okay. Why? What is, so the argument we have, this is discrimination and a whole range of, and the Turnbull government quite rightly has, and I hope it leads to impact, and this process might grind to a halt if the Productivity Commission that has a review underway of the impacts of horizontal fiscalization on productive growth of Australia. That is the way to tackle it. This is not necessarily just about body politic, which as the leader of the opposition I have to be totally concentrated on. Well, not totally, but mostly. Second, it's not about just a fair deal for Western Australia, and I would go through that. But it's also about the systems that redistribute money from high yield, high gain areas to consumption in other areas. And that's what's happened. We have had large amounts of money pulled from infrastructure and developments that underpin the fastest growing areas of our economy, whether that be iron ore or LNG or agriculture, to pure consumption in other states. And what it is it's a dynamic inefficiency, because if you look at what the Grants Commission does, it takes the pool of money and pays people to stay put. It pays people not to move around to responses to higher yields, better lifestyle, whatever motivates them. It's sit-down money on a wide national scale, on an intergenerational basis. That's inefficiency. And the biggest challenge we have as Australians is going forward is, where is our productivity growth going to come from now that the mining boom has subsided? So it's an attack on our future. And also, one of the biggest issues is in the process is that there's asymmetry between revenue. They can measure revenue pretty well, but a whole range of the costs associated with how they treat this are not treated adequately. The way the Grants Commission does is a regional development. Well, here's a per capita income set by the national basis, sometimes a benchmark in New South Wales, sometimes they cook it up themselves, and it's on a national basis. Back in 2012 and 13, Victoria and New South Wales had very little regional development. Nothing was going on because they stopped their mining sector to a large extent. Ours, regional development, was going off the chart because we had the largest investment in this nation's history in our regions, mainly Karratha and Port Hedland. But they equalized it. Of course, we had much higher than they, but also it was productive growth. Well, they forget it. Another thing they did, the Grants Commission, is they decided in most states, eastern states, rural and regional wages are less than metro wages. That's not the case here, because we ran out of people in the north. People on Karratha at one time, madly, were paying $1,200 to rent a room up in Karratha. Of course, they were making $200,000 too. Wages differentials were not adequately treated. So there's a whole range of fundamental problems, not only with the basic tenets of horizontal fiscal equalization, but also the way it was operated. In my argument, it was fundamentally discriminates between the productive states that decide to get off their bum and allow mining companies and resource companies to come here and drill, frack if they wish, put in railways, and help resolve native title and all those things that go with resource development. The other states have failed, other than Queensland, have failed to do it. It's discriminatory. And it's also discriminatory against all of us because we're the poor for the policies that provide incentives to do that. Thanks, Jessica. And again, I mentioned the volatility of that. It just, we now, Tasmania gets about 40 to 50% of its income, maybe a bit more on GST. We get 20+% on the most highly volatile source of income. And you know, when you have a volatile income, what do? You have to put something aside. If you're in a volatile industry, you have to have large levels of equity or cash sitting around to cope with the volatility of revenue stream. That means, particularly during a boom time, you're taking huge risks. And that's what happened. We went into deficit. There's also an issue, this is a technical issue with the GST, is that they have lags built in the system. So there's a 3-year lag in revenue now, and with this volatile iron ore, on 2014-15, the GST's assumption was that iron ore prices were $118 when they were $37.70, and they assumed we had revenue based on 118, but we had actually revenue based on less than a third of that, or about a third of it, and we went into deficit. We had revenue streams collapsing from iron ore, and we also had revenue streams from GST collapsing at the same time. If that's not discrimination, go heave. I don't know. I almost did. So what do we plan to do about it? Well, we got some legal advice, and we're going to pursue it. Going back to the original federal roads, there was a test back in 1926 as to the appropriateness of one of the initial grants from the Commonwealth, and this policy underpinned Commonwealth grants to the states ever since. And it was a literal interpretation of Section 96. It's quite clear that the Commonwealth can give grants to the states unfettered. And the decision at that time in 1926 from the High Court judges was very clear. I think it had 3 or 4 lines. Yes, they can do it. Since then, there's been a number of interpretations, particularly 2009, since in 2009, where the High Court said a couple of things. You have to interpret Section 96 not by itself, but in the context of all aspects of the Constitution, particularly 55(2) and 99. That essentially allow grants, if you put it together from me as a layman, allow grants to be provided, but subject to non-discrimination on the basis of taxation and non-discrimination again on other aspects. That is, you can do this, but you can't discriminate. Now, they're all, in this world, discrimination, the word discrimination is probably, as well as sustainability, is probably one of the most misused words in the English language. So and the lawyers have ways to interpret that. But our argument will be that the system as it has evolved is discriminating, again, in terms of the grants and the process, both for Western Australia and for Australia, and it needs to be reinterpreted. Our challenges, of course, are manyfold. First, get access to the High Court. I'm confident that there are a number of people in Western Australia who have been hard done by, appropriately, by the decisions of the grants commissions, therefore we can get access. And our legal advice is, preliminary as it might be, is that the High Court will look at this issue. That is, we're confident we will, if we can get an appropriate body to make a claim to the High Court will entertain the issue. That's what they've signaled in recent times. And the task will be to prove discrimination, and that it is. Now, there's another reason for doing this. There's a real flaw in that. We see the solutions both to federally, from the Turnbull government, and to the Shorten government solution to this is actually to accentuate the fundamental problem. That's where I started at. Their solution is to go out there and borrow more money to solve the perceived, and I think real, belief in discrimination in WA. First the Abbott, and then the Turnbull government gave the states put in a floor of 37.6%, so gave them, over the last 3 years, $1.2 billion. But that was borrowed. We don't want the Commonwealth to borrow more. They already have pushing towards $500 billion. We want no more taxation, but fair distribution of existing tax raised. Shorten yesterday came out with a promise of $1.6 billion. It's not clear where he's going to get the money, but it's either higher taxation or borrowed, and as we know, borrowing is taxation deferred, so it's higher taxes. We don't want that. We want an appropriate, rigorous allocation of the monies already raised in Western Australia. And we also want, a really important issue is that states like Joh Bjelke-Petersen have long hid behind the Commonwealth in terms of getting the Commonwealth to dole out great big dollops of money that they can either earn or justify themselves. And we strongly believe that the best thing for going forward is, in fact, to have, for fiscal responsibility, is to have the states more fiscally responsible for the money they raise as well as the money they spend. And third, we want to make sure that this Grants Commission's actually stopping people and resources from moving across our nation to the highest valued uses. And so we want to, it will pull one of the major impediments to resource allocation in our nation, not just to WA, but probably to WA, but around the country. That's the challenge we have. I would welcome any ideas. I would welcome debate on it from your society. We haven't committed to this yet, but it's a path we're going down, and I'd welcome any ideas. Thanks very much.